give me a confirmation. There we go. Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining Walks Conservation Cafeteria. This is where the Wyoming Outdoor Council and our diligent staff talk about some of the latest and greatest conservation issues in the state. And we're here today to learn about the designation process for the Sublette Pronghorn herd. Just a couple quick reminders before we jump in. We're asking all participants today to stay on mute during the presentation. We'll have some time at the end for questions and answers, but feel free to drop questions using the chat feature in Zoom. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. And you can drop those questions in at any time, although we'll be waiting till the end to field some questions for Megan here. And we asked too that although WALK works on a lot of different issues, please keep your questions related to wildlife and specifically, if you can, pronghorn migrations and connectivity, sort of in that category. So again, we'll be recording the conversation and just want to kick it off today to say a few things about migrations within Wyoming. I mean, we have some of the most unbelievable wildlife migrations, including the Sublette Pronghorn herd. And back in 2020, and Megan's going to talk about this in detail, under the leadership of Governor Gordon, created an executive order that was meant to designate and identify some of these corridors where wildlife move. And it really is an amazing tool that goes a long way in protecting connectivity for these animals. So really hope you enjoy the presentation today from Megan, who is WALK's Wildlife Program Manager. And she's going to talk about this designation process and specifically how right now is a great opportunity for the Sublette Pronghorn herd within this process. So, Megan, unless I forgot anything, I'll hand it off to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Alec. And I will go ahead and start sharing my screen because I, as is my wont, have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll get that going. And yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. There it went away. Sorry about this. Let me try that again. Sorry, everyone. Okay.
And Megan, we did have your PowerPoint was up there.
Yeah,
For
I pressed a weird button, so I think I've got it now. Okay. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Alec, for welcoming participants. We are here today to talk a little bit about the Sublette Pronghorn Migration Corridor and an effort that is underway currently by the state of Wyoming to consider designating and getting protections in place for this migration corridor. So hopefully we can give you some information to help you be informed about this process. And I'm breaking it down into a few topics. We're going to have like a brief orientation talking about migration corridors in Wyoming and what the migration corridor policy is, talk a little bit about the Sublette Pronghorn migration corridor itself, and let you all know how you can provide comment and be part of the process. So for orientation, Wyoming migrations and our migration corridor policy. Wyoming, as Alec mentioned, is unique for the number of long distance migrations ungulates can still make here. There's been a lot of research done and a lot of collaring work in the state of Wyoming. And just to give you a flavor, all of these purple lines on the map are long distance migrations that mule deer make in Wyoming. We have similar for pronghorn, lots of pronghorn moving between summer and winter range. And elk also. All of these purple lines are routes that animals are traveling to get between summer and winter range every year. And if you're wondering why Wyoming still has these long distance migrations that have fallen by the wayside in a lot of other places, this map gives you a good primer. It's basically a map of where there is built infrastructure on the landscape. And with the exception of Nevada and maybe I guess eastern Montana, Wyoming probably has the least built infrastructure of anywhere in the lower 48 states. So it means that we really still have room for big game to make these long distance movements across the landscape because there isn't a lot impeding the flow of movement as of yet. So, of course, migration is when ungulates are moving from their winter range down low up to summer range higher to access forage. But migrations aren't just a highway from point A to point B. They're actually habitat in themselves. So I have these little dots on the map, and that depicts stopover habitat. So within a migration corridor, there are places that animals will stop and hang out for a long time, eating and resting and building up fat reserves. And so the point is, migration corridors aren't just a pathway, they're habitat in and of themselves that are very important for animals. Of course, scientific documentation of Wyoming's long distance migration actually goes back decades. I don't know if anyone on the call remembers back in the day, biologists used to put these kind of visual collars on our ungulates to be able to keep track of observations of them across the landscape. So before we were tracking with GPS, someone could put a visual collar on a pronghorn in the Green River Basin. Next summer, it shows up in Jackson, and people go, aha, these animals are actually traveling really far. The missing piece of the equation was we didn't know the exact pathway they were using to get between these different locations. So with advances in GPS collar technology, we now have the ability to do incredibly precise mapping of migration corridors. And to give you an example of that, all of this orange and yellow on the map is the Sublette Pronghorn Migration Corridor. And you can see we're zoomed in on Pinedale, Wyoming. If you live in Pinedale, can look at the street and figure out if the pronghorn are migrating right through your neighborhood. So an incredible level of detail compared to back in the day when we were just using visual collars. Of course, there has been a lot of research done enumerating the benefits of migration, and I'll run through those for you now. Animals that migrate long distances tend to have superior body condition than animals that are residents. And that's because if you're a migratory animal, you are tracking that spring green up and basically eating the best forage there is from the beginning of spring late into summer. If you're a resident who's just hanging out in the same place, you get that first pulse of green and there's not great food the rest of the summer. So these long distance migratory animals have much superior body condition to non-migratory animals. And that means that if you're a migrating animal, you have improved reproductive output. Superior body condition means you can have more fawns and they're healthier and more likely to survive. And if you're having more fawns, that leads to larger herds. So a lot of our migratory herds in Wyoming are much larger in population size than they would be if these animals weren't making long distance migrations. So that's something we really want to protect. Of course, there are impacts of development to migration, and the chief one is direct habitat loss and habitat avoidance. And to explain how that works, if you look at this map on your screen, the purple on the map is locations where pronghorn were heavily using habitat before a solar facility was built down by Green River, the Sweetwater solar facility. And you can see in that purple, before anything was constructed, they were using the habitat pretty heavily. If you look over to the orange map, that's after the facility was constructed, you can see that not only did pronghorn lose that habitat within the dark black line of where the solar facility is, they're actually now avoiding habitat on the east and west side of that facility. So when you have development, it's not just the footprint of the development, it actually has spillover effects far beyond that, where animals are avoiding habitat they used to use. Another thing researchers have found is that animals can travel faster through development than they would have before development was there. And that is a problem because it creates this mismatch between the animal's movements and peak greenup. If one of the main benefits of migration is to access the best, juiciest forage as it becomes available, you really don't want animals speeding through developed areas because then they lose the opportunity to hang out and rest and feed on that green forage when it's at its freshest. And that, of course, leads to a gradual loss of the benefits of migration. If animals aren't able to maximize that really good forage when it's available, they aren't putting on as much body fat and they aren't as healthy when it's time to have their young. So we have this great data now from the really precise maps from GPS collar technology, and it revealed that there was this previously unrecognized habitat in the state of Wyoming, and that led to calls to protect it. And that attracted the attention of state government. So that leads us to Wyoming's Migration Corridor Executive Order. It's called the Wyoming Mule Deer and Antelope Migration Corridor Executive Order, and it was signed by Governor Gordon in 2020. And when he signed it, 3 mule deer migration corridors were designated just with his signing of the executive order. The Sublette mule deer migration corridor, which actually overlaps pretty well with the corridor we're talking about today, Sublette Pronghorn, also Baggs mule deer and Platte Valley mule deer. But those corridors didn't go through the full public process that Sublette mule Pronghorn needs to. They were sort of grandfathered in with that stroke of the pen. So Sublette Pronghorn would be the first migration corridor to actually go through the full designation process outlined in the executive order, and it would be the first migration corridor that the state of Wyoming designates for pronghorn. So to live up to the name of that EO, mule deer and antelope migration corridor protection, this would be our first for antelope/pronghorn. All right, so now we get to look at what the designation process entails. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's a bit of a doozy. I have a bunch of arrows kind of to guide us through the whole flow chart of it. But what happens is if the Game and Fish Department, they have data on a migration corridor and they want to take a deeper look at it and figure out if it needs protections, the very first thing they do is they draft what's called a threat evaluation. And that's just, they look at the map, they come up with a list of what they think the threats are. It's not a super in-depth document, but it's kind of a starting place. Then they put that out for public comment and try to get feedback from the people of Wyoming about what we think about it. And then they take that feedback and finalize the threat evaluation before bringing it to the Game and Fish Commission, which is kind of the governing body of the Game and Fish Department. They make a presentation to the commission, and the commission can decide what they want to do with that migration corridor. So there's a couple things that can happen. One thing that could happen is the commission might hear the presentation from the game and fish biologists and say, okay, this is great. I like the map you came up with. It doesn't really feel like this migration corridor is super threatened. So let's just identify it, have the map, and call it good. We don't need to go on to designate it. However, they might also vote to pursue designation, in which case they would direct the department to go further down the designation pathway. And that is what happened last year. The Game and Fish Commission voted in favor of pursuing designation for the Sublette Pronghorn Migration Corridor. So after the commission gives that granting of pursuing designation, Game and Fish drafts a much bigger, meatier document called the Biological Risk and Opportunity Assessment, where they really do an intense deep dive, break the corridor down into multiple segments, figure out what are the specific risks and threats for each segment. And they have drafted that for Sublette Pronghorn now. It's 140 pages long. It's very detailed, and it is out available for the public to look at right now. So they are collecting public comment as we speak. The public comment period runs through May 2nd, and this is really the public's last chance to have meaningful input into the process before it goes further along. After that May 2nd deadline, Game and Fish will finalize the risk assessment based on the feedback they got. They'll again present to the Game and Fish Commission, who will vote on what they want to do. They can either say, you know what, I'm not convinced by what the biologists are telling me. We don't think we need to recommend designation to the Governor Gordon. Let's just stick with identifying it, leave it at a map, and not add new protections. Or they could vote to recommend designation to the governor. And if they do that, it's out of Game and Fish's hands and it falls on Governor Gordon's desk. In that case, the governor would appoint an area working group representing stakeholders like mining, agriculture, conservation, oil and gas, county commissioners, like a whole bunch of people who care about what happens to their part of Wyoming. That working group would get together and kind of analyze the corridor, looking at both biological and ecological considerations, but they also would be looking at the socioeconomic implications of a corridor designation. Once they've done that, they share their determination with the governor, and then the final decision rests with the governor on what to do. And there's 3 options for what the governor can do. The governor could say, you know what? I don't like it. I don't think we need to designate this. I'm going to reject this corridor for designation, in which case, again, It's still identified, there's a map, but no new protections. The governor could also say, I don't know, I feel like it's not quite there yet. Let's return it to Game and Fish and have them massage it a little bit, and then we'll consider it again. Or the governor could say, I think we have a winner. I'm convinced we're designating the corridor, and then protections go into place. So that is what the designation process is. And again, we are kind of in the last meaningful opportunity for public comment. You could go to the commission meeting in July when they vote on this and testify in person, but it's a lot easier to comment now over the internet or via mail than driving to Evanston or Casper or where they ever end up having that meeting. All right, so maybe asking yourself, okay, so designation creates protections, but what are those protections? So basically, designation protections apply to state permitted activities on public and state land. Does not apply to private land at all, but for public and state land, some state permitted activities you might use as an example would be an application for a permit to drill, a large scale solar facility, a wind farm. A lot of these like energy development projects fall under the category where protections would be in place if those were proposed in a designated corridor. And in this case, permitting would require consultation with game and fish biologists. Game and Fish often provides feedback on proposed development, but with designation, they have a much stronger authority and a real seat at the table to work with project proponents to make sure that recommendations are made and attended to that can protect habitat. And the levels of habitat protection vary based on how heavy the use is for migration in that part of the corridor. Bottlenecks are the most restrictive as far as what can go there. There's no surface disturbance or seasonal human presence when animals are migrating in bottlenecks. And that's because bottlenecks are these really kind of constricted areas where the big game only have one narrow pathway they can use to access habitat on either side. And if you sever connectivity there, you can kind of have the whole migration breakdown, whole chunks of habitat can be lost, loss of range. So that's why the bottlenecks are really heavily protected under this migration corridor executive order. High use areas, these are areas that are heavily used, but they aren't quite as constricted as a bottleneck. And in these places, you would limit surface disturbance and human presence to maintain corridor functionality. Similarly, if there's a stopover within high use, that would be that like green shaded area if it falls within the dark green boundaries of high use. Those are places that you would have to avoid surface disturbance and limit or avoid human activity seasonally. And then finally, the vast majority of the corridor is this medium and low use. And these are places where development and use can occur. There's just like added consideration to minimize disturbance. But if we zoom back and look at stopovers, high use, bottlenecks, like these are tiny areas that there would be more regulations coming to bear. All right, so there are some additional benefits beyond the protections that are kind of codified in the executive order. One thing is designating a migration corridor. It's really signaling a commitment from the state of Wyoming that it is all in to keep a corridor functioning on the landscape. And it just gives the state a stronger basis for negotiating protections down the line. For example, there could be federal land use decisions where the federal land managers may not have a migration corridor kind of baked into their directives and their land use plan. If the state of Wyoming has designated a corridor, it gives them much stronger negotiating power to talk through proposed uses on federal land in a migration corridor. Similarly, county land use decisions, that affects private land, but if the state has made this commitment and designated a corridor, it just kind of opens the door when they're talking through the importance of protecting habitat with the counties. Another benefit of designation is it can unlock federal funding. We have something called the USDA Migratory Big Game Initiative. And if you look at this map, it shows some of the priority areas in Wyoming for this initiative. And what it does is landowners in migration corridors are prioritized for habitat and fence funding. So if the Sublette Pronghorn Migration Corridor were designated, we'd have a much bigger area in Southwest Wyoming where landowners could be put to the front of the line for some of that funding to improve habitat. And finally, designation is a great thing because this is the part in the process when Game and Fish identifies bottlenecks. And as we've talked about, these areas are super vital for maintaining connectivity across the broader corridor. So when you identify a bottleneck, that can help conservation entities and governments focus resources on these migratory linchpins. And just to give you an example, this picture here is the Red Hills bottleneck. It's in it's in Bridger Teton National Forest. It's along the Gros Ventre River. And you can see here, we're on a super steep slope. There's a river below. The animals don't have anywhere else they can go. And I think there's portions of this bottleneck where it's only 2 feet wide. So it just illustrates like how narrow and how important these bottlenecks can be. All right, so you made it through orientation. Now we can talk a little bit about the actual Sublette Pronghorn Migration Corridor, both the history and why it needs protections. So this is a very special migration. Pronghorn have undertaken it for thousands of years. I think several of us have heard about the archaeological finds at Trappers Point showing that the tribes have been hunting pronghorn along this migratory pathway for millennia. It is the longest pronghorn migration in Wyoming, and it supports one of the world's largest pronghorn populations. I think sometimes we forget and take pronghorn for granted because we have a lot in Wyoming, but Wyoming really is the epicenter of the whole world's pronghorn population, and other states do not have the kind of herds we do, and this is one of our biggest herds. So this migration into Jackson Hole was actually lost in 1929, and that was a result of a population crash following unregulated market hunting at the end of the 1800s. Luckily, the Game and Fish Department created regulations, helped the population rebound, and the migration into Teton County was reestablished in 1955, but it did take a while. And this migration was actually the first to be federally recognized when the Forest Service designated the so-called Path of the Pronghorn back in 2008. And if you look at this map, the green is Bridger Teton National Forest. The red is the migration as it had been mapped in 2008. And basically that federal recognition just meant that there were added protections within that green Forest Service part of the map. However, there have been ongoing calls to protect the portions of the migration further south on BLM lands because, as we've said, you can't really protect a migration if you only protect a part of it. You really have to protect the whole thing. And especially since the devastating winter losses of the 2022-23 winter, when this herd lost about half of its population, it really is time to act and make sure that they can keep migrating, keep building up that body condition, produce fawns, and recover. Especially in northern segments of this population, the herd is not recovering as fast as biologists would like, so they really need our help. All right, so now a quick run through the data that Game and Fish has presented in their biological risk and opportunity assessment. They've used over 20 years of data, 415 collared pronghorn contributed data points. There are hundreds of thousands of individual GPS locations, and it is one of the largest data sets for any ungulate herd in the world. So the level of precision that we can get with this map and this data is kind of unparalleled. It's shown that over 75% of the Sublette Pronghorn herd is migratory, so that means the vast majority of animals in this herd need to migrate to make their living. If they lose the migration, we're going to have a much smaller population. The maximum travel distance is 165 miles. There's some individuals that go all the way from I-80 by Green River all the way into Teton County, and it's just astonishing that we have animals traveling that far. Okay, so it is true that there are some existing protections that kind of overlap with this migration corridor. For instance, we have some federal land designations like Park Service property, wildlife refuges, wilderness and wilderness study areas, the Path of the Pronghorn we talked about, and the BLM has some protections in place too. The state has things like the Sublette Mule Deer Migration Corridor that's been designated that overlaps partially. We have big game crucial winter range. We have greater sage-grouse core area, game and fish commission lands, and even on private land, there are conservation easements that help protect portions of this migration corridor. So you might be asking yourself, well, if there's all of this already in place, why do you need to designate the migration corridor to keep it functional? And the answer is twofold. For one thing, a lot of these designations only cover a tiny portion of the Sublette Pronghorn Migration Corridor. Park Service, wildlife refuges, wilderness study areas, the path of the pronghorn, game and fish commission lands, and conservation easements, none of those overlap with more than 4% of this migration corridor. So if we're relying on those to keep the corridor functional, it's not going to happen. Conversely, some of the BLM categories of designation and big game crucial winter range and sage-grouse core area, those do have larger overlaps with the Sublette Pronghorn Migration Corridor, but they don't cover the whole thing, and the management prescriptions they put in place do not protect migratory pronghorn, right? They might be focused on protecting an endemic species of plant for these BLM areas of critical environmental concern. Big game crucial winter range just protects winter range during the winter season, not during spring and fall migration, and greater sage-grouse core area mainly protects leks and stipulates a certain amount of disturbance that can happen. There's no protections for bottlenecks, for high use, or for stopover. So we can't protect this corridor based on these designations, even though they are helpful for conservation more broadly. All right, so now we're going to do a very quick tour through the migration corridor. Game and Fish has broken it down into 10 different segments. And the main reason I want to do this is in case anyone on the call is familiar with these areas, recreates there, lives there. Like, Game and Fish really does want to hear from people with knowledge on the ground and get your input on what they've gotten right and if they missed anything in their assessment in this document. So the north segment of the corridor, this is up in Bridger-Teton National Forest. There's the Red Hills bottleneck that we saw a picture of earlier, Bacon Creek bottleneck, and Twin Creeks bottleneck. So this is all on federal land. Then the Bondurant segment kind of goes into the foothills there. Summer range not in the Tetons. We have the Rim bottleneck in that segment. Get into the foothills segment. This is kind of like Pinedale, Cora, Daniel country, and there's a bunch of bottlenecks in here. There's Kendall bottleneck up north. There's the Noble Basin bottleneck off towards Bondurant there, which thankfully it's private, but there's a conservation easement, so it's pretty well protected. We have the Daniel overpass and the Trappers Point overpass. Both of those are bottlenecks. And down south, there's this Big Piney bottleneck that's been identified. Moving down more towards LaBarge from Big Piney, there's this Calpet segment that doesn't have any bottlenecks, but if you look at how dark all of those lines on the map are, it's very high use. So this is important movement territory for the pronghorn. We look at the central segment. This is Pinedale South. There's a couple bottlenecks. There's the New Fork bottleneck along the New Fork River and the Green River bottleneck along the Green River. And these two kind of feel significant because they're two of the main ways that pronghorn can get down off the high country on the mesa and access more temperate, lower elevation winter range, especially in big snow years. So those are very important bottlenecks. We have the Fontenelle segment. It's a little bit less used, but down there at the southern end of the Wyoming range. We've got the southwest segment that gets down to I-80, and this one does have a bottleneck, the Blacks Fork bottleneck. And if you look at that, I don't know if you can see on your screen, but there's a little hole missing towards the northwestern portion. And I'm going to zoom in here. Once again, it's an example I'm going to keep coming back to. This Sweetwater solar facility was built right in this very important movement pathway that turned out to be a bottleneck. So again, in the purple, you can see pronghorn were all over the place in there before this solar facility was built. Afterwards, the orange dots, you can see that because the solar facility has a very tall fence around it for security purposes, pronghorn can't get in there anymore. So this bottleneck is very important because it's already been taken a bite out of to the point that it's hard for pronghorn to get through there anymore. So this feels like a bottleneck that we really need to preserve and maintain and make sure that it doesn't get any more chewed up than it already has been. All right, back north a little bit, we've got this east of 191 segment around Boulder down from Pinedale. And this one doesn't have a bottleneck, but again, you can see it's pretty dark purple. So it is a very important kind of artery for animals to travel down along the foothills of the Wind River Range there. And we've got the east of Farson segment that gets into that red desert country a little bit and even more in this red desert segment. So that's all 10 of them. And again, if you go check out the full biological risk and opportunity assessment, you can see all of these maps. You can look at individual segments, and definitely if you have on the ground knowledge of any of these places, like please review the place you're familiar with and let Game and Fish know if there's anything that you think they got wrong. Okay, so another thing in the risk and opportunity assessment is an enumeration of the threats to this migration corridor. And the very top threat is habitat fragmentation. Probably not a surprise. And the two things that are fragmenting habitat the most are rural residential development, which we can see in this picture here, and energy development and mineral extraction, which we can see here. And I am going to throw up the residential development next to the mineral and energy development overview, just because I think it's striking how similar they look from the air, right? We have a bunch of roads, we have chunks of habitat that's been eaten up. So they actually are pretty similar, although I would contend this residential development is even more problematic because we have more people, more cars driving in and out all day, more noise, more lights, dogs, fences to keep horses in. So it really is a problem for these animals. And hopefully we can try to keep this from happening in the most heavily used portions of the corridor. So definitely habitat fragmentation is top threat number one, but there are a bunch of secondary threats that if we don't address them, the corridor could still fall apart. One big one is impermeable fences. Pronghorn are not good at jumping over a fence. And if you have a fence with woven wire or a really low bottom wire like this, they may end up traveling miles and miles out of their way trying to find an opening. So making the landscape more permeable would be really helpful for this corridor and fixing some of these fences. Restricted bottlenecks is a problem. Again, this is the Sweetwater Solar Facility. We really don't want to be building up the areas that are bottlenecks because once you do, you really can sever connectivity and cut these animals off from parts of their range. Invasive weeds are a problem. I think we all know about cheatgrass. It makes for lousy forage. It degrades the habitat quality. It makes for more frequent, larger wildfires, and it is a problem throughout this migration corridor. Horses have been identified as a problem in the southern segments of this migration corridor. And finally, even recreation. And I personally love to go out shed hunting in the spring and don't like to think that I'm causing a problem, but if you get more and more people that are out on the landscape in the spring, hunting antlers, or in the fall, like just recreational hunting and harvesting, like as more and more people show up on the landscape, that can have an impact. So these are all things that we kind of need to think about and consider if we're going to preserve this migration corridor. So again, we have some opportunities if this corridor gets designated. And the main thing is game and fish biologists can work to try to locate new development outside of the high use stopover and bottleneck areas. That's a very important piece of designation. And since habitat fragmentation is the top threat, this is kind of the crux of the whole issue, right? We can also kind of prioritize areas for conservation easements and habitat leasing by having this corridor designation, maybe like focus on certain areas or be able to access better funding if the corridor is designated. We can focus fence modification and improvement projects where they need to go, and again, hopefully access better funding if the corridor is designated. There's also opportunities to plug non-producing and abandoned wells, followed by reclamation, try to get the habitat back to what it was before development took place, like plant some sagebrush seedlings, get bunch grasses back on the landscape. Obviously, like in concert with that kind of reclamation, do cheatgrass and weed treatments to keep the habitat as healthy as it can be. And finally, doing sagebrush habitat and wet meadow restoration. And I don't know if any of you have helped out on one of these Z-dike structures before, but it's basically putting rocks into an existing meadow to try to slow the water down as it's flowing through the landscape, make it soak into the water table, and just like keep the water in that place so that pronghorn and mule deer and birds and insects and all of the species in the sagebrush steppe can use that wet meadow and not have the water just zoom on out and pass out of the ecosystem. All right, you did great. We got through the hard part. Now this is the easy part. It's public comment. We want to know, where do I fit in and how can I help? So again, as I mentioned, the deadline for public comment is May 2nd. So you have about 2 weeks left if you have not submitted a comment yet. And Game and Fish is really looking for your input on two primary questions. They want to know, should this migration corridor be recommended for designation? Yes or no? Do you feel like, I agree, we need more protections, let's designate it? Or do you think, no, it's probably fine, I don't think you need to designate it? And then the second question is, what feedback do you have on the assessment? Again, that's a question of, if you look at the maps and something stands out to you that seems wrong, or something that seems really right and you want to applaud Game and Fish, like definitely share that with them if you have added input there. So these are the steps to comment. You can address yourself to the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission, since they're the ones who are going to be voting on whether to recommend designation to the governor. They'll do that in July. You can share whether you think the commission should recommend designation to Governor Gordon, share why designation is important to you. You can offer input on the risk assessment, say what you like and should stay and what could be improved upon. Sign off with your name and where you're from. And it's fine to be really brief. You do not need to write a whole page, like even just a sentence or two is fine. And saying thank you never goes amiss. So that's everything you could do in a comment, but the two main things to do are share whether you think the commission should recommend designation to Governor Gordon, and then really like sign off with your name and where you're from, because it goes a long way to let people know who you are and what the stakes are for you. So if you don't do anything else, but you want to submit a comment, those are the two things to focus on. But if you do want, and if you want to go submit a comment, we have some links to share with you. The Wyoming Outdoor Council has a Sublette Pronghorn landing page at this link, and the Game and Fish also has their own comment portal at this address. And you can go to either place. Our landing page will kick you over to the Game and Fish comment portal. But if you go to our page, we do have these really cool limited edition pronghorn stickers that Wyoming artist Bria Hammock created as a thank you for people who submit comments. So if you submit a comment and you would like a sticker, like we're happy to send you one as a thank you for participating in the public process. So you can do that at our landing page. So if you want to go more in depth and talk about more than just yes, no on designation, these are a couple of suggested talking points. Cite it right. Designation gives game and fish biologists more authority to protect migratory habitat in the face of new development. The fact that keeping bottlenecks open is so important. They're just a tiny fraction of the corridor, but have massive impacts on connectivity, and we really want all 12 to be retained in their entirety. This herd really does need our help. We've lost about half the herd, and they need all the help they can get to keep migrating and build their numbers back up. You can talk up Wyoming's wildlife heritage and the fact that we have some of the few remaining long-distance terrestrial migrations in our state, including this world-famous Sublette Pronghorn migration corridor. It's really a source of pride and something that we need to protect. Trust the science, right? We have a huge data set that's incredibly comprehensive, and we can trust it to guide protections to maintain corridor functionality. Can definitely mention that this is a Wyoming solution. Our migration corridor is a unique homegrown solution to conserve ungulate migrations, but it doesn't do any good if we don't use it. So let's use it for Sublette Pronghorn. Can talk up the fact that migration frees up money, that USDA Migratory Big Game Initiative, prioritizing funding near corridors for benefiting wildlife and landowners. And finally, and this is the one that I like to use when I write a public comment, is just what does the issue mean to you? Tell the story of your connection to this herd and this species in Wyoming. So with that, I know we suffered through a lot of maps. So Elizabeth Boehm from Pinedale graciously let us use one of her cute pronghorn photos here. So that's how I'm going to end the presentation, and we'll open it up for any questions or comments.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks, folks who put comments in the chat. And certainly, if you have more, please add them to the chat here, and I'll do them in order of how we got them. Megan, this first one is from Brock Wall. Do oil and gas permits to drill on federal lands also have to get approval from the state oil and gas regulatory agency? I'm happy to field that one too, Megan.
Yeah, Alec and I both have some oil and gas background here. Yes, the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission is the state agency that gives permitting for companies to drill in the state of Wyoming. So those kind of permits would apply on federal land regardless of what the federal land use plan said. It's a good question. Thanks, Brock.
We'll go on to a second one here, Megan. This is from Olga. Who opposes this designation?
You know, that's a good question. We haven't heard a whole lot during this part of the process. It's been very quiet. There have been two public meetings so far last week, and no one with an oppositional opinion was at either of those meetings. There will be a meeting tomorrow night in Pinedale at 6 p.m. at the library. So if you're in Pinedale and have an opinion, that would be a great opportunity to share it. I think the last time around when the threat evaluation came out a year ago, there was some, I guess, there was some questioning from some industry groups about whether designation was fully warranted. And I think that was the main voice. It wasn't full opposition necessarily, but like questioning. So we'll see what happens this time. But definitely, if you have an opinion, please share it during the comment process.
Thank you, Megan. And Brock has another question here. Brock says, my understanding around the Sweetwater solar facility is that it could have been prevented if the designation was already in place. But is it somewhat accurate that the BLM would likely not have approved that project in its current location if the corridor was designated?
I think that is possible. I know that the state did have very strong concerns about the siting of that project and voiced their opposition or, well, voiced their concerns when it was getting approved. And I think they had been told by the BLM that if the corridor were designated, that it would have been a stronger argument against that facility going in where it went.
Thanks, Megan. And follow up here from Olga. Can the solar facility be modified now to make migration easier?
That is a great question. And there are some ideas that researchers and biologists have come up with. Like one of the main problems is the solar facility, it's in the bottleneck, but there's a state highway that goes through the facility. So rather than putting the facility all on one side of the highway, they have it on both sides. And because those high fences are on both sides of the highway, if animals get stuck on that highway, they are at serious risk of getting hit. And that actually happened in the winter of 2019, where thousands of pronghorn showed up on that highway, and it was very scary and deadly for them and motorists. And so there's been talk about moving the high fencing back closer to the solar panels and having a shorter right-of-way fence that it would be easier for the pronghorn to stay away from the highway. Unfortunately, the ownership of that solar facility has changed. So even though biologists had made some inroads with the previous owner, it now is under new ownership. So they have to start those negotiations and talks all over again. But it's a great question. Like, we can't totally fix what happened there, but it could be made slightly less bad. And I hope that that happens.
Another question here from Brock, Megan. Would any of the bottlenecks benefit from an overpass?
That is actually a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I think that would be a question for Game and Fish, maybe, if you're able to get to the Pinedale meeting, or you can always email someone from Game and Fish. Our big game migration corridor coordinator, Jill Randall, is based out of the Pinedale office, and she might have more information for you there. But if I hear anything, I can email you what I find out.
Great. Well, at this time, we don't have any other questions in the chat. If anybody would like to follow up here, just wanted to thank everyone for joining today on Walks Conservation Cafeteria. And Megan, if you want to just give us one last reminder and pitch on why we need to support Sublette Pronghorn, and we'll finish with that.
Okay. I would say this has been a project on the part of the state for years, and a lot of researchers and Pronghorn have worked to get this information together. And this really is kind of our last chance as members of the public to voice our support in like the kind of procedural way where we can have the biggest impact. And I just really urge everyone to make sure that you comment one way or the other by the May 2nd deadline. And I hope you have those links. We will post this presentation on our YouTube channel, so you can find it there. And we'll also have slides of the PowerPoint presentation posted on our website. So stay tuned for those resources. And yeah, thank you all for joining and listening in.
Thanks all. Have a great day.